In Module 6, Lesson 5, we're going to describe the distribution that's displayed in a histogram, and we're going to specifically look at relative frequency. In Lesson 4, we investigated the head circumferences that the boys and girls basketball teams collected. Below is the frequency table of the head circumferences that they measured. Isabel, one of the basketball players, indicated that most of the hats were small, medium, or large. To decide if Isabel was correct, the players added a relative frequency column to the table. Relative frequency is the value of the frequency in an interval divided by the total number of data values. In other words, it is the decimal relationship between the part and the whole. The first thing we'll do is to complete the relative frequency column in the table, and it's been started for us. The extra small hat sizes, we had 2 people that needed the extra small. Notice our tally marks, and then we wrote the number 2 representing the number of tally marks we have. The relative frequency table then is going to be the frequency or the number of occurrences, and then the total number of people surveyed, or hat sizes, or whatever you want to call that. So for extra small, we have 2 in our numerator. That's how many people need an extra small. And 40 in our denominator, which was the total number of people who were surveyed or who were going to get a hat. 2 out of 40. And then that was converted into a decimal by dividing the numerator by the denominator. And we have a decimal of 5/100ths. The same thing was already done with the small hats. There were 8 people needing a small out of a total of 40. And when we simplified and turned it into a decimal, we got 20/100ths. When we complete the relative frequency table, adding all of those decimals up should give us 1 whole. So the total of our relative frequency table is 1. Which interval has the greatest relative frequency? Well, when we compare our decimals, we see that the medium, or that is 550 to 570. And then the percent of head circumferences between 530 and 589, 530 and 589, that would be these 3, small, medium, and large. And we have 20/100ths, 375 thousandths, and 225 thousandths. And when we add those 3 together, we get 8/10ths, or 80/100ths. And if we change that to a percentage, that would be 80%. Remember, we move our decimal point 2 places to the right. And when we move it 2 places to the right, we'll need to add a 0 in the empty spot. The players decided to construct a histogram using the relative frequencies instead of the frequencies. They noticed that the relative frequencies in the table ranged from close to 0 to about 40/100ths. They drew a number line and marked off the intervals on that line. Then they drew the vertical line and labeled it relative frequency. They added a scale to this line by starting at 0 and counting by 5 hundredths until they reached 40 hundredths. They completed the histogram by drawing the bars so the height of each bar matched the relative frequency for that interval. Here is the completed relative frequency histogram. Notice the difference between the one in lesson 4 and this one in lesson 5 is that our y-axis is now not in numbers of hats, it's in the relative frequency. So we have 5 100ths, 10 100ths, 15 100ths, 20 100ths, etc., all the way up to 40 100ths. And we are graphing the relative frequency, or the decimal equivalencies, that we made in the table. Next, we'll evaluate the histogram in terms of patterns. To describe the shape of our relative frequency histogram, we want to remember that we were looking at whether it was symmetrical or whether it skewed left or skewed right. So when we look at this histogram, it appears to be relatively symmetrical. There's nothing that's unusually to the left or unusually to the right. This histogram, if you recall, is very similar to, as a matter of fact, exactly the same shape as the histogram that we completed for the same data in lesson 4. Isabel said that most of the hats that needed to be ordered were small, medium, and large. Was she right? And then what percent of the hats to be ordered is small, medium, or large? So when we look at the histogram, and I'm going to scroll back here to see which categories are small, medium, and large. That would be 530 up through 589. So 530 to 589 would be these 3 columns, and that is clearly in the majority of the data. We have 20 hundredths. Let's get the exact numbers. 20 hundredths, 375 thousandths, and 225 thousandths. And we determined that amount to be 80% in question 4. Next, we're given a different set of data, and we're going to look at the frequency table and create the relative frequencies for the seating capacity of arenas in the NBA basketball teams, ranging from numbers of seats that are 17,000 up to 22,500. Remember that the relative frequency is making a fraction and a decimal out of the actual frequency numbers compared to the totals.